your host, Steffi Pilarinu, and today I have a guest, a frequent guest with us, Dr. Eelco Fiole, who has been with us this year, earlier in the summer, to discuss the Terra Luna blow-up and the governance issues around that. And earlier this year, we were discussing about governance in the tokenization space. Let me welcome you, Eelco. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much, Effie.
Unfortunately, we have here another, if you want, painful experience in the crypto space, although we'll have the opportunity to discuss. It's not really endemic to the crypto business per se, or to the nature of the asset, but rather to a broader issue. And why don't we start by maybe highlighting 2 or 3 of the main violations, and I'd like to sort of zoom into governance business violations that you see from this debacle with FTX, and of course from what we know up to now, because of course it's a very complicated case with many, I understand, entities, 134 entities globally, different jurisdictions involved. What would be the 2 or 3 big ones, and again, around governance violations?
That's an excellent question. Of course, we all look at the juicy elements, a bunch of kids around a pool in the Bahamas and so on. But from a more, let's say, almost drier perspective, there are indeed 2, 3 big governance lapses. I think the most important one, number one, is the complete lack of understanding by the management of FTX that they are dealing with other people's money, and as a result, they have fiduciary responsibility. And this means that they need to place the interest of customers and investors above their own interests. So commingling funds is clearly a violation of that right there. Part of that fiduciary duty are things like prudence, loyalty, care, candor, all things which in the investment space are very well described. And that's something that was clearly not upheld at all. There's no trace. If you think about the comments by the liquidator that we've all seen, there was no trace of understanding of fiduciary responsibility. The second big governance lapse was that there was basically no board, and so that means that the senior management SBF could do whatever they want without any reflection, without any input. And the function of a board, or one of the functions, is of course to look on behalf of investors that the company is robust and has robust processes and controls in place, and which enables strategy to be reached. And so without a board, no oversight over controls, and we also know by now that there were basically no controls within the company, within the group. And so that is a big red flag right there. And we're going to speak about red flags a lot, I would think. And the third one for the moment, and you've highlighted this already, there was an enormous amount of legal vehicles, over 130 companies, which, you have to almost ask yourself, what was the intention behind it? This was made so complex. And anybody who runs a bigger organization with many vehicles knows how much time and effort it costs to maintain those legal vehicles, but also to watch out for a huge amount of conflicts of interest within the group. I'm not even talking about the conflicts of interest potentially with FTX investing in the VC firm that invested in them, but just, conflicts of interest within the group already and also the diverging incentives that all those entities would have. And so this complexity basically makes it very difficult to govern in the first place. So even if you had a board or have all kinds of boards below that, it will be very difficult to run that. And so I think the lack of fiduciary duty, fiduciary responsibility, and understanding that, the absence of a board, let alone a decent board, and the third thing, the complexity in the legal structure, were clear governance violations right there.
But Eelco, is the fact that there were so many entities, is it sort of, should we think that maybe it's typical of a business that is global, like an exchange, and therefore has to have different entities in different jurisdictions? But I guess, I'm sure, I mean, we have more than 130 countries globally, but I don't think that's the excuse. But in your experience, are most of these businesses with so many entities because of the complexities of regulation?
I think that the regulation here, and we'll speak about it in a moment, I'm certain, to a large extent is still absent. Even if there is regulation for exchanges, of course, then it smells here that there was maybe jurisdiction shopping. I can imagine that you need entities as special purpose vehicles for transactions, for one-off transactions, maybe even for specific clients. And then there is, of course, the case of, as I say, jurisdiction shopping. Where can I get stuff done with the least level of oversight, not only in terms of regulation being in place, but also how much focus will a regulator have. And typically, if you go into smaller jurisdictions, then those regulators do not have a huge amount of staff to regulate the whole financial center to that level. And so, as I say, it will be interesting to understand what was the intent of building that huge network of legal entities, and were these entities also then maintained? Because sometimes if you have the transaction done, you don't need the entity anymore. You want to close it down, because the more entities you got hanging around, the more complex the whole thing becomes. Mind you, these entities also need administration, right? There's accounting going on, there's administrative services going on. And so that all needs to be managed. And that is just operational complexity that you don't need.
Yeah. Eelco, you mentioned, the lack of a regulation overall that we're all familiar with. I know that, you lecture and speak about these issues, especially governance and due diligence in this environment that is not an environment that is seasoned, that we have regulations or practices that are deployed for a long time. But can you share with us some perspectives on that topic? And before we do that, give us also a distinction between due diligence and governance, and whether we were lacking both in this case.
So the short answer is yes, we're lacking both. I think that's obvious. But having said that, due diligence is something that you do as a process where we want to verify that the investment that you're about to make actually is manageable, and that you understand the risks. And so there are a couple of elements around due diligence. There's investment due diligence, risk, operational, legal aspects, and so on. And once you've made your decision to invest after the investee company successfully passes all of those stations, then the only friend that you then have as an investor afterwards is the governance body that an investee company has. Because you do this initial due diligence, you may want to do a fresh up a year later, let's say, but the ongoing oversight over the business is done by the people who represent you as an investor, and that's typically the board. And so the board, which exercises governance, and governance here, in this case, you could think about things like, are there controls in place? How robust are these controls? Is there risk management going on, etc.? Regular reporting, and so on and so forth. That is sort of your, as I say, as an investor, that is your best friend. I would think that governance is also the best friend of the investee companies to project trust to investors and say, I know you can't visit me every day, but guess what? We've got governance in place, so you can, you can breathe,
sleep
right?
well. Yeah,
you can sleep well. Now, you mentioned the regulatory piece. To the extent that regulations are not in place or unclear, we need to think about a few things. First of all, regulations are sort of the minimum that a regulatory body is putting in place. And so it doesn't speak to all risks, and it doesn't speak to all aspirations. And so we have to ask ourselves, in a what I call pre-regulatory phase, as we are now in many of these innovative businesses, what are then concepts that we can apply already, as an investee company, but also as an investor in terms of what are you looking for, without waiting for a regulator to get in. And I think there is a responsibility there, call it the fiduciary responsibility, to already put some things in place. If you are in this blockchain and crypto world, we need to recognize that while this is highly innovative, innovation also brings unknown risks and also unknown behaviors. And if you've seen, of course, how much greed there is in this sector, then you can imagine that this has an effect on the behavior as well. So I think that as I said, there's a couple of principles that we can apply. So, for example, you mentioned tokenization. If I speak to tokenizers, and I do this all the time, actually, I would ask questions like, okay, how have you handled KYC? How have you looked at ALM? And if then the 30-year-old graduate in math, sometimes they're genius, many times they're not, but then looks at me and says, what do you mean? Then I know, okay, this needs to be in place. And otherwise, even if the regulator hasn't asked yet, because otherwise things can go wrong later on and blow up in our face.
Yes, yeah. But what I don't understand, and this might be a naive statement, is, okay, we are in a pre-regulatory environment, as you call it. But the case of FTX it's just an exchange. The fact that it was trading crypto and not stocks or options or any other financial product, why does it matter? Shouldn't the regulator in the Bahamas apply the same sort of rules and checks and balances as a regular exchange or brokerage business?
So the short answer is yes. The regulator in the Bahamas should, oversee an exchange as an exchange. Now, what feeds into this in the complexity here is, of course, that this is an exchange that deals with crypto, and that means that there are some risks in there which are not so typical for regular exchanges. And so the regulator will need to be able to understand what crypto is all about. I mean, there are technology-specific risks that we have in crypto which we don't have in other markets. So, so on the one hand, and this is, by the way, also an important feature of due diligence. So if I say that we have a standard kind of process for due diligence, the risks that we have in this space are partly the same as in other investment areas, but also partly different. If you think about smart contract risk and oracle risk and so on and so forth. And so in this case, the regulator, you would have to ask yourself, what was the license under which that the Bahamas regulator gave, if any, and how did they satisfy themselves that the risks were managed appropriately? I agree with you when you started out a few minutes ago. This is not per se a crypto blockchain problem. that we have seen blowing up here, even though it is there's an element of it, of course. This is first and foremost a complete failure of governance, of risk management, and on the investor side of due diligence, clearly.
I mean, there's no smart contract here involved. There's no, it wasn't a failure of the wallets or anything really that is, crypto native.
Yeah.
Everything that, at least for now, we know that went wrong could have gone wrong in a regular business. And what's amazing, you mentioned that FTX did not have a board. Does that mean that the VCs, and especially the lead VC that invested in them, did not have a seat on the board? I mean, I thought that was standard and typical in any VC investment, if you're the lead investor or after a certain size, and so on.
Well, that's a good question. I think what I've heard in the news is things like, SBF is going to be the first trillionaire. And so even if you can have a small piece of that as a VC investor, then this is attractive. You have to ask yourself, what procedures did they follow? I think it becomes clear that many have just been co-investing and relied on somebody else who also did not do the due diligence. With all love and respect for my friends in the VC world, I mean, we have now seen so many VCs coming up. Everybody nowadays is a VC. In this case, of course, we have the most well-known name from the VC world going in. The negotiations, what went wrong, how were they sort of fooled into this? That is something that I'm not privy to. Is it standard to be on the board? Well, if there is no board, then they would have to have relied on what they've seen in their so-called due diligence, and also with the idea of we'll follow it continuously. We don't need somebody else, a governance body, to do that for us. And I think that this is a misjudgment.
Yeah, and especially when we're talking about a company that, as you said, was expected to become $1 trillion company. And in that case, what we are realizing is that it affects whole economies. It's affecting the economy of the Bahamas. It's affecting the economy of Miami, and I don't know where else. And I'm talking about the guy that was selling coffees, the restaurant guy, the hotel guy, the whole economy that is built around an ecosystem, right?
That's right. I think that we need to be aware that in this kind of situation, the risk that's being taken is the risk with other people's money. 10 billion transaction volume a day, 1 million customers. So the risk that FTX took was the risk that they did with other people's money, not with their own money, let's say at a first stage. Yeah. That's one. And I think what the Bahamas regulator also needs to understand, but anybody that's doing risk oversight, is this reputational risk. I think the value destruction, by a simple estimate, is well over $100 billion right there. And I'm certain that somebody's doing the numbers right now and will come maybe to a higher number. Market impact, opportunity cost, funding not flowing, you name it. And so all kind of secondary exposures, let's say. And so I think that from an oversight perspective, this contagion risk also needs to be taken into account. What does it do to the Bahamas? Who is going to trust the Bahamas regulator now going forward, right? So I think that it is not just, if I say regulations, oversight over the exchange and the risk that is in the exchange itself, but it goes well beyond the operational risk or the trading risk, for that matter, at an exchange, which already by itself is serious enough if you know that it's all other people's money and not their own, certainly not in their commingling kind of style of running the business.
In your opinion, Eelco, I mean, I know you are not only doing business around governance around the world, but you are very much focused in the blockchain space. Which jurisdictions do you think have understood in advance, before this blow up, the importance of governance in the digital asset space, broadly speaking. I'm not talking only exchanges.
Yeah. So overall, governance is a misunderstood, let's say, element of this, and it is also not used enough. So the short answer is that I wouldn't know any jurisdiction which gives this the attention that is needed. Having said that, we see, of course, elements of which feed into governance, which some jurisdictions have already put in place. And so we see regulations coming in place in Europe. We have regulations in Switzerland, for example. We have legal certainty around coins in Switzerland and some other countries. So these are all elements which help in with due diligence and also help with governance. But the requirement to put proper governance in place and what that means, that is something that in the digital space is not specifically singled out yet. Now, having said that, if you look at investment funds in this space, in blockchain and crypto, then obviously investment funds are underlying the governance for the investment fund industry. And so exchanges, a similar story should be, right? And crypto banks need to have a banking license. And so if we lean on, let's say, the existing frameworks of governance or of regulation, I should say, then there are many well-developed centers. Having said that, what it then means in the implementation phase, how is governance then being done? Do they have people on the board that understand what they're looking at? That requirement is not strong enough yet. As I say, it's an underused mechanism, and it's a pity because I will say this: I think if we had some governance in place, then we may not have completely avoided the damage, but the magnitude of the damage, in my mind, would have been much, much smaller. Same with Terra Luna earlier this year. And that's something that a governance body, of course, is tasked to look into.
Plus the reputational and tainting damage that is on top of all this. And when all this happened, I can't help but think of especially protocols in their structures, their treasury structures. They have a lot of money. They have a big war chest compared, to just regular private companies. And there I wonder again, do we have proper governance or not? And will this become a reason to sort of improve these standards? Because there again, we're talking about something completely new, right? The legal structures that the protocols have with, I mean, they're born here in Switzerland, right? The structure.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to say about this. To the extent that these treasuries are packed in a foundation structure, for example, the regulatory environment around this is very light. And the foundation regulator is typically not used to foundations which operate in this space. And so the governance of the foundation itself then becomes really, really important. And so that is something to look into. Then if you look at the governance of protocols, this requires a very careful design, especially now that we're moving into Web3, where basically we give away, if you will, almost functionality to people who then work with protocols themselves without much influence of the developers, but these whole economies build up around these protocols. That governance design becomes absolutely critical for trust and for valuation, because you can imagine that if it blows up at some stage, the values first skyrocket and then drop to zero. A lot of people, and trust leaves the room, and a lot of people are just going to be disappointed. So that is on that side. On the Treasury DAOs, I think we need to recognize that the DAO in general cannot cover everything that we need from a governance perspective. Certainly not if we look at cases of conflicts, if we're looking at interaction with off-chain bodies and so on, with the legal structure and so on. And so it is not so easy to design a treasury DAO which fulfills all the ambitions also of all the ecosystem participants. And so this goes well beyond things like voting structures, functionalities around coins, and so on. And that also requires careful thinking and design. It's not straightforward. It looks straightforward because people do not necessarily know what governance is. They just speak about it. And as a result, it looks simple, but it needs careful thought. There are not so many which out there, which I think do enough, good enough job of this, even though there are a few that, of course, recognize that this is important. But then the question comes, now what? And here I'd like to say something which is, which I think is also in the FTX case visible. There is some merit to getting some governance experience on board, let's say, in some kind of capacity, and not just somebody who's potentially smart, potentially not, and talks fast about a technology. That is just not enough to run big exposures. As you and I both know and experienced, and many of maybe the viewers as well, before you get to run hundreds of millions or 100 million upwards or plus of funds for in an asset manager or in a treasury function, you have to be fairly senior. You have to have, you have to get some experience before. And so the lack of experience that people have in this space, is something, is something, yeah, is there. It's scary. And luckily I come across many bright young entrepreneurs in this space that realize this and they want to do something about it.
Yeah. What is your opinion about suggested best practice that CZ has suggested around proof of reserves? And today I was reading that Jesse Powell, the CEO of Kraken, is completely trashing it and then saying that proof of reserves won't work unless you have proof of liabilities. How do you see this?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's we need to applaud CZ's initiative that he wants to have this open discussion around about disclosing and projecting, again, what I call projecting trust to the wider public. Now, I think what Jesse Powell correctly is saying is that this discussion needs to be broader than just proof of reserves. How are these reserves made up? What's the valuation of these reserves, and so on. Liabilities clearly is something that people are interested in, and maybe others. And so if I want to make a comparison, with these very large and important players like Binance and Kraken and others, of course, then I think the comparison should be that we look at things like the Basel framework for banks, where there's requirements around capital adequacy, and also governance, by the way, the two big pillars there, requirements for listing rules. If you look at the stock exchanges, what do they require in terms of disclosures? As I say, from the investment fund side of things, what do they require? And are there lessons in there that we can apply to the blockchain space? And I think the answer is going to be yes. So I think that we don't need to sort of polarize this discussion too much. As I say, I think it's fantastic that two such exposed entrepreneurs are taking part in this debate and come up with suggestions which help the industry forward. Because as I mentioned before, the damage out of this is way more than just the whole of 8 to 10 billion in the balance sheet of FTX.
Clearly. I mean, the names of companies like Dune Analytics and Nansen are coming up frequently. I'm familiar with those who probably there's more in the space, and everybody's talking about, sort of using these, because if I understand correctly, they provide on-chain analytics. And if you're a pure blockchain business, it's like you could have real-time balance sheet, income statement, your financials up there.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure that quite works. I mean, in a lab situation, right? But do you think that we'll be heading there? I think Ethereum has their on-chain data with Dune Analytics, and maybe there's other protocols.
Yeah. So 2-3 things. The first thing, so yes, this is the direction of travel. We will see more providers of these kind of services, which help us in due diligence, in ongoing monitoring, and so on. At the same time, we need to watch out that the data that we get is actually also the data that we need, and so that we also understand what these data actually show, and so that you can sort of outsource the production of this data and be a consumer of it, but you cannot outsource the fiduciary responsibility that you actually understand what you're looking at and make decisions on it. So we see all kinds of providers coming online with services around blockchain, which I think is very helpful. I think one of the most important, though, services that we need to develop is, a lot more robust kind of assurance, like what the accounting firms do, give a stamp of approval after the year is over. Let's say these kind of assurance services need to be required. They need to be offered by providers, and we need to be able to rely on them. So that goes a little bit further, if you will, than just providing the analytics. Mind you, I think with some of the dashboard providers, you can specify what data you want as well. And so that means that the ask of an analytics provider is very, very important. Do we understand what we're asking, or are we missing something out? And so that becomes an issue as well. So I think that is a very positive development, early stage.
Yeah, I mean, even in the mature traditional space, what to measure in a risk report, or in general, what to monitor under risk management is not always evident, right? And
right.
Naturally, in this space, there are going to be blind spots. It's a very new space. We're not sure what we understand. And more importantly, to interpret, because everybody talks about, oh, it's on the blockchain, therefore transparent, but I don't understand any of that. It's out there. So what does that tell me, right?
That's
All
right.
these addresses or flow movements and charts, what does it mean, right?
That's right. And we're lacking as an industry. We're not there yet. So regulators are not there yet, but also many investors are not there yet. Many participants are not there yet. They talk about it, but there are not so many who actually know the detail.
Yeah. Are there any bodies that companies in the crypto space can join, that these industry bodies are more focused around good governance, from which they can share practices or learn, or join to overcome this difficult period?
Yeah, I think that's the sort of the sad answer is no. I mean, there are many governance bodies out there which propagate good governance and so on. I'm also associated with a couple. They're typically play in the corporate governance space, in the investment fund governance space, which is quite different still from crypto and blockchain. There are some private initiatives that I know. I know of one in New York. I know of one in London. That are trying to make inroads in this space. There are probably others as well, but it is very very early stage there as well. I think though that there are lessons, from as I say, from corporate governance, from investment governance that we can take. So I think the closest what you can get is when you get to speak to people like me, if you will, that sort of bridge that space. In the traditional corporate investment governance space, it is not so obvious. It's not so obvious that people are able and willing to make the jump, if you will, and bridge over, because it does require some work. I must say that for me, it started now 5-6 years ago, and so I've been in it now. But for people today, it is work. It is not an easy task.
Yeah, again, I mean, we're going back to G for governance, which we spoke about a while ago, that it is misunderstood, undervalued, if you want, and not discussed enough. And like always, only when there's these types of, I don't want to use the word accident. What's the right word? What shall I say?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not accident. We need to check intent. It is also ignorance. There's a lot coming by. I agree with you. Governance is in many cases your only ally.
Yeah. But it also goes against this growth at any cost, and obsession about I became a unicorn in just 6 months. My valuation doubled or tripled or went up 10 times in the shortest period. Yeah. It's all, this business culture doesn't help, right?
It doesn't. I was thinking about that today as well. My son is learning piano, and the question is, how good is he going to become? And then I think, if you think about the pianist Lang Lang, right, the Chinese world wonder pianist, there's a reason why there's only one Lang Lang. And so not everybody can be a unicorn, not everybody can be a Lang Lang, not everybody can be a Ronaldo. And so I think we need to be honest about these things. If my son is doing well piano, I applaud him. I do not expect him to become a Lang Lang.
Yes, but it's also not, that doesn't mean that he's not succeeding. There's other aspects to it, right?
That's right. And he has good governance because I provide governance for him on his journey. The road to unicorn, you need to be able to be trustworthy and to your stakeholders and so on. And so that helps you moving forward, not by being riskless and being lucky. That is something else.
And it depends. If the goal is to have a sustainable business, then right. The first goal is not to become a unicorn as fast as possible, and then it's more to have a sustainable business, right?
I recently saw somebody who said, I prefer to be a camel than a unicorn. Yes. Right, because the camel is resilient, it can do without water and survives, and all of these qualities.
Yeah. We do live in interesting times, and let's see if we get more. I like to think of the dolphin businesses rather than the shark businesses. I'm thinking, the animal analogies, but in the water. So it's, I see, coming from Wall Street, I've seen sharks, I've seen piranhas, the small ones that really can bite and are very aggressive. And then there's the dolphins. So let's see if we can get more dolphins out there. But we all know that it really depends on the people, right?
It's sad because what happens now withdraws funding from beautiful new projects, which have a lot of good people in place and so on. Everybody is suffering again. So the project that CZ launched with the 1 billion fund is in that sense a beautiful initiative. which is, by the way, is not just venture capital, right? I mean, there's going to be things like turnaround qualities, synergies in projects, and so on. So this is not just charity, if you will. So I agree with you. We don't need more sharks. We need, and we have many people who just want to build sustainable businesses on this. So
and blockchain as an infrastructure clearly has so many cross-industry use cases, be it in agriculture, be it in social impact, in so many, in manufacturing and so on. And this is a huge damage because it's going to impact great businesses with great, impact and potential.
Absolutely. And we see this happening. As I say, VC funding not flowing. VCs that tell me that they are investing, but at the same time they're sitting on 70% dry powder. Valuations are down, so actually time should be good, which hurts founders and so on. It's it's, as you say, it's a mess. I know social impact blockchain, which has difficulties, even though doing very well in terms of funding. It's that's what I'm saying. The damage is well beyond FTX and well beyond the investors that lost money on FTX.
Well, this is again, let's hope that lessons are learned and we continue with optimism and spreading the good word, right, Eelco?
Yeah, we charge forward, and I'm certain that many people who are seeing this also charging forward as before.
Yes.
In that sense, before FTX, if you were positive, there's no reason not to be positive now. There's a lot of beautiful developments going on in DeFi, and so on and so forth. So there's, to the extent we can, that the funding is there, we need to charge forward.
Okay, Eelco, thank you so much for this discussion. And I'm sure that I hope that next time we'll be getting together and discussing something much more positive.
I will ping you when I have a couple of examples that I'm working on. Thank you, Effie.
Great.